Udbhav. How are you? Thanks so much for taking the time to be on our podcast today, The Impact. Viewers, Udbhav is the public policy advisor for Mozilla in the Asia-Pac region. And today we're going to talk about what does it mean for tech companies to be doing business in India. Udbhav, do you want to get started? I mean, India is supposed to be the next hot market, especially with all the walls going up in China. So is this a good place for foreign tech companies, particularly American, but anyone else for that matter?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I think the question is a very interesting one, right? Because if one were to look at the history of how the internet has sort of progressed in India, ever since it really kicked off in the late 1990s, there was a period of slow growth, but reasonably steady growth. But about, I would say, in the year 2005 to 2006, it became very clear to some of the largest technology companies in the world, specifically consumer-facing technologies, that there was a tremendous opportunity in India, not just in the size of its middle class and in terms of their spending power and how that was increasing because of India's economic development, but also because of the potential to solve things for India first, which would then help them solve things for the rest of the developing world. And that entire idea really led to most big technology companies that are famous right now from setting up offices in India and really very aggressively pursuing a market strategy of user acquisition. And that largely, I think, if one looks at between time periods like 2010 to 2015 to 17, largely was unrestricted, right? The regulatory framework, while present, and there were some challenges around things like intermediary liability, was largely supportive. And there was also corresponding growth in connectivity in India, thanks to the growth of 4G connections that really brought on hundreds of millions of users for the first time onto the internet, largely on their mobile phones. And all of these factors put together really helped create pretty much a gold rush for consumer technology in the country. I would say since then, and once again, it's not that none of this happened in the past, but it's just that the culmination of many of these issues seem to have been over the last 3 to 4 years. I think that some of that positive sentiment has slowed down marginally, not tangibly. I mean, we saw with, for example, Reliance Platforms investment, that they raised last year included well over, I think, $20 to $30 billion worth of investment from some of the largest investors in the world. So it's not like people aren't putting money in the market anymore, but it's just that they're pursuing a different strategy, where it's more holistic, looks at the ecosystem in a much wider manner. And I think regulation has a very big thing to do with that, because the government, not just, I think, reacting to developments within India, but also elsewhere in the world, have started proposing laws and regulations on things like data protection, on things like intermediary liability, and on things like connectivity, that have, at least in some ways, proven to be challenging to some of these technology companies. But also that growth of the internet has also, I think, hit that so-called middle class that many of these large technology companies really wanted to go for, right? Which is not the sort of elite 5 to 10% of India's population, but everyone from there till about 50 to 60% who were presumed to be have these reasonable purchasing power parity, have the ability and the means to be able to spend on the internet. So a lot of those people, and I think if you look at numbers in the most recent IMAI report and some others, the population of India on the internet is now approximated to be anywhere between 650 to 750 to 800 million people. So it's that other 300-400 million that are left are not only much harder to get online, but it's also much harder to sort of monetize them than it has been so far. So I think all of those things put together, I wouldn't say have given technology companies pause, but it certainly has made them reconsider their strategy for operating in the Indian market, and that's very much an ongoing process.
So I want to pick on two things you said. One is that there's a large chunk where the tech companies haven't figured out how to monetize them, right? And that's a problem for them. And the other aspect that you mentioned that you said might be or is problematic is regulation. So I guess the business side of things will evolve as and when people's ability to spend money increases, right? And that's got nothing to do with the tech companies themselves. But can you talk a bit about the regulation aspect on why that is a problem? I would think to bring in things like data protection policy, et cetera, should be good steps. What is the problem over there? Can you expand on that?
Sure. I mean, I certainly agree with you in that, like, regulation in these sectors is largely a good thing. Like, even if you look at the technology companies themselves, they, for quite some time now, whether it's responses to public consultations, whether it's hearings, like, I have openly supported regulation on areas like data protection and for fields like content moderation. I think the challenges have been in the provisions within some of these laws and regulations. So most technology companies, consumer facing ones, work on very centralized models of product development, right? Like, you may have teams spread out all over the world, but more often than not, there is one version of a product, right? Like, there is one version of, say, a service like YouTube. There is one version of a service like WhatsApp. There is one version of a service like Twitter or Reddit, and so on and so forth. So the fact that there is one version makes it quite challenging to implement or not implement certain product features in certain countries, have different processes for content moderation for certain countries and different for others. In the example of WhatsApp, provide encryption or end-to-end encryption in some countries and weaken it in others. So the fact that this development, because it's fundamentally centralized, doesn't take very well to individual laws and regulations. Mm-hmm. It's far more well suited for long-term, like, consistent global regulations that provide predictability to these technology companies. And it's that predictability, I would say, and that consistency with how laws, say, exist in the European Union or in the United States that I think has caused some concern. There are, of course, reasons around privacy, security, freedom of expression, and the impact of all of these laws and regulations. But even if one were to keep them aside purely from a business perspective, if you need to like make special processes for India that may or may not, may clash with values like privacy, security, and freedom of expression, but otherwise are also, like, will set a precedent where if individual countries start offering their own laws and regulations, and you will have to modify that product for each and every country, that is not necessarily a very sustainable model at the scale at which these companies operate, with like 2 billion users and 3 billion users all over the world. It's therefore, I think, like, that's also given them some pause. And I wouldn't, which is why I use the word pause. I don't think they mean that we've abandoned the Indian market or we will not care about its issues anymore. It's much more a case of figuring out strategy and seeing how to comply with developments, right? I think using the Reserve Bank of India's example of what they did with data localization all the way back in 2018 is a good example.
Can you expand on what that example was? What did they do, and why is that a useful example to look at?
Absolutely. So the data localization example is one where the Reserve Bank of India mandated that payments data need for transactions that began in India and of Indian users had to be necessarily stored in the country. There were some exceptions where it could be out of the country for processing for the first 24 hours, but then would have to come back and things like that. But at the core, it is making sure that the financial data of Indians stays physically within the territory of India. And they it took about a year, I would say, for the give and take and negotiations between platforms for, the deadline to be set, the deadline to be complied with. There were some extensions and so on and so forth. But ultimately, if one sees American Express a couple of, I think 2 months ago now almost, or maybe a month and a half, was told to not onboard new customers because it hadn't complied with these regulations. I think MasterCard was told to do that this month. But if one were to look at other companies that were impacted by this as well, things like WhatsApp, right? Things like Visa, as another example, it's clearly a case where, at least so far, they have managed to convince the RBI that they are complying with those provisions better than these other companies have. So it's not like the service is stopped or that American Express or stopped working in the country or anything like that. But it's just that you now have to take into account local realities in a much more effective manner. When in response to regulations, and that isn't always very easy and certainly takes time.
So I just want to push a little bit on this, Udbhav. I mean, we are seeing this play out in China right now as we speak, right? So from the government's point of view, if they say, hey, this is the gold rush you want, this is the market you want to be in, so play by the rules of this market. I can understand on sensitive issues like privacy, on things like encryption, which is a very sensitive topic, right? But on other issues, why is there a hesitancy on the part of the foreign companies? Is it that they're not very comfortable with the rules? Do the rules need to be tweaked? Is there room for negotiation, or is it my way or the highway? What is the scene on the ground?
I would say in practice, it's a combination of all of those things, right? Like, to give you one indicative example, the recent intermediary rules that India has notified in February of 2021 contain provisions around personal liability of executives in these companies, right? And even if one were to look at examples of the sort of countries that we were discussing just a little earlier, right? Like if one were to look at Russia, one were to look at Turkey, like many of these countries also have restrictive content laws, but even they have a far more gradual process, right? Where first there's an investigation, then you can get fined, then the fine amount keeps increasing, then you get taken to court, and then there is a possibility that there may be charges brought against you for blatantly disobeying the law of the country. And if one can contrast that with what's happening in India, where there is no gradual process, there is no due process in terms of what the escalation process will be, and it just directly jumps to the fact that there are 3 officers that the law requires you have to appoint, and the law very clearly says that they may be held liable for the actions if they don't comply with government demands, right? It's a very sort of frank but also a fairly harsh approach to liability and to ensure compliance in Indian regulation as well. So I think that's just one indicative example. Outside of privacy and security, the set of things that businesses hold valuable, right? Global uniformity, predictability, the ability for them to make sure that their personnel aren't placed in physical danger because of actions of that company, right? Just imagine there's a request that comes on a Saturday and that person is on leave on a Sunday, and on Monday the chief compliance officer has an FIR registered against them, and that is completely legally tenable. It may not happen, but it might end up happening, right? So I think it's some of those things that are from a sort of business environment perspective not as conducive as the past, because it's not like India didn't have a content moderation regime, and everybody agreed that that intermediary liability regime needed to be reformed. So it's just, I think, certain aspects that are particularly problematic that make it much harder for these companies to openly be okay with them. But again, that's not to say that they're not complying with them, right? People are putting out transparency reports, people are claiming compliance with the rules. So it's, I think, another sign of the fact that they may be slower, they may be more deliberate in what they want to do, but it's clear that they want to be here, and they still believe that India is a fairly valuable market, and will therefore keep doing whatever they can while pushing back on the things that they think are above that threshold that they cannot accept.
Okay. So, just if we follow the news headlines of the last few weeks, it really feels like at least some of the large American tech companies and the Indian government are pretty much at loggerheads. That's how it seems to be. What is the resolution? Instead of a complete, like you mentioned, I'm going to throw you in jail tomorrow if you don't comply within, immediately. Is there a process for resolution over here to move forward? And are the two parties at the negotiating table or not?
I would say, firstly, I think there is definitely a certain amount of resolution that is already taking place, right? Even if one looks at the companies that we're talking about, the individual companies have very different approaches to dealing with these things, and their public ramification and the conversation around this also focuses on certain companies more than the other, and that changes depending on what the piece of content is, what the latest issue is, and so on and so forth. So I think that it's in the interest of both parties for there to be a resolution. I think it's quite clear that the strategies for pushing back that individual companies that they end up adopting may be different. Some may be much more aggressive and public. Some may be much more pointed in internal conversations but not engage adversarially publicly. Some may just choose to comply because they don't really want to get in that position. So there are different routes and approaches that everyone is taking. That's the first bit. And the second bit is, I think that from the companies and from the government's end also, I think they don't really want this reputation. I think the intention of the rules may be many things, but it is certainly not to make India not a viable sort of destination for carrying out business when it comes to the field of technology, right? The government's priorities on that front are very, very clear. So because of that, I think there are some signs already, if you see, there are statements from officials saying the IT ministry saying that we will come out with standard operating procedures under the IT rules, that the data protection bill will account for concerns from the industry. There's a lot of give and take on both the sides. And I think that process is going to take time. for rules that have the impact that the current IT rules do, and for laws like the data protection bill that like will now hopefully get like introduced in the parliament in the next session now in winter. These things like have very long gestation periods, right? We've been talking about the data protection law since 2018. It's likely to now pass, I would say, in like 2022. Will take at least 18 months to 2 years for it to come into force, and we're already in 2024. So none of these are problems that I think will immediately get resolved or will get resolved in 6 months. They will take time, but I think both parties are making the efforts, some in the public fora, but like much of it like in closed doors, to arrive at consensus. And just like in any negotiation, there is give and there is take. I don't think the government will get everything that it wants, but neither do I think that the technology companies will be able to, like turn the clock back to 2004 and live life with the laws and regulations that existed at that time either.
So, Udbhav, you've been in public policy space for a while now, both in India and now in Asia Pac as well. What would be your, 2 pieces of advice for any company that wants to come to India and do business?
I think the first piece of advice would certainly be to understand India as a market. Like, it's many technology companies have made the mistake of trying to enter the market with a product that works somewhere else and really trying to like then sell it to Indian users, right? And I don't just mean this from a how users experience the product or what users' needs are, like all of those are relevant, but I also mean this from a what are the laws and regulations, what is the Indian society's like general outlook or mindset to some of these issues. Like the whole idea of smaller companies not being like not investing as much in understanding the like other newer markets that they enter into, and then like that entire idea of like almost moving fast and breaking things, and that launch the product, we will see if any problems happen to fix them later. That isn't as sustainable as it used to be in the past, and like anywhere in the world, in India even more so, because like the general like tone and public perception of technology companies has started like shifting from just being completely positive to being much more balanced. So I still think it's like largely positive, but also because like the consequences of things going wrong are much stronger. Like not just because of laws and regulations, but because like
that many more people on the internet.
Precisely, and the understanding of those issues like may not be completely widespread, but it isn't like negligible anymore. I would argue that it's not even nascent anymore in terms of mainstream public discourse. These are things that people know and people understand much more than they used to even just 2 or 3 years ago because of everything that's happened. So that would be the first bit. The second bit I would certainly say is that the importance of like making an ecosystem play, right? Like I think like companies, when they enter the Indian market, not all, but like most, I think like are too focused on like profit, on user acquisition, and a bunch of things that don't really look at like what is the technology ecosystem in India, who are the industry associations that work on it, what are the civil society groups and think tanks that do work in a particular space, like who are the supporters of a particular move, who are the detractors to a particular move, right? And a lot of this sounds like pure public policy, but it's actually also like business development. It's also like many other aspects of running a successful business is being like known for like engaging with everyone in an ecosystem, because it's something that like the larger technology companies took a long time to figure out. They took like almost a decade, maybe more, like from when companies like Google and Facebook like were founded to when they had their public policy teams to when they started having the huge public policy teams. It took a long gestation period. But like if I were to say that if I'm a fresh technology company launching now, I think that time period would probably be a fraction, or that latitude would not exist for me at all. So to invest that time in like understand the effort in understanding the market, knowing like who your allies are, and then leveraging it to like make sure that you are known to stand for a particular set of values, whatever those values may be. Like they may be, we will listen to the government completely. They may be, we will never take a piece of content down. Like it's
whatever. People
can take their stance, but you can't just afford to like launch a product from a room somewhere in the United States and then just hope for like to make a lot of money here. I think we're well past that time.
You have to put some skin in the game.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Udbhav, for taking the time to speaking with us. This was great. Thanks a lot.